believe it is already Thursday. This week has just flown by for me, but it is great. All of the time that I have been able to spend preparing and presenting God's Word and also getting to know you people. Tomorrow night is our last night of this meeting. And I hope that we can get a lot of young people here if possible. I feel the things that I've been preaching have been so good for everybody, but tomorrow I'm pretty much only going to be talking to anybody that still has to answer to somebody at home. So I don't know, that could vary in age, I don't know, but we are going to be talking about the home, and we're going to be talking about what exactly it does mean to honor mom and dad. And maybe there'll be something for you if you still have a living parent. Might be a little bit something for you as well. But most of it will be about honoring mom and dad. Because honestly, right now, there is nothing more important than the home. And it needs to be strong. And so that's what we're going to end the week on. We've already established this week that Jesus was a real man. He was a real teacher with real followers 2,000 years ago when he really was executed by the Roman government. And we know his followers base all of their faith on the idea that he came back from the dead. Last night, we started looking at the logical evidence for the resurrection. We're going to continue to examine that tonight. But we're only going to focus on two specific theories or arguments that you will hear from those that deny the resurrection. You can't deny that he lived, and you can't deny that he died. But what do we do with the people who say there is no way that he came back? How do deniers explain the growth of Christianity if it's based on something that did not happen? One of the theories explaining away the resurrection is the conspiracy theory. Now, this theory says that Jesus was just a man and that he really did die, but after that, the disciples somehow got his body and just told people that he had risen from the dead. They lied about seeing him after the resurrection, and they continued to perpetuate the lie because it gave them power. Now, we already looked last night at how hard it would have been for the disciples to steal the body and how unlikely that really was. But for the sake of argument, we're going to go with that tonight. What if that is what really happened? J. Warner Wallace, he thought that was the most likely explanation. Wallace has been a homicide detective for almost 40 years. And he was an atheist until the age of 35. And like many other non-believers, he thought the claims related to the resurrection were most likely just lies on the part of the alleged eyewitnesses. So he decided to examine these claims using the tools of a detective. Now, in his career as a homicide detective, Wallace has had plenty of opportunities to investigate and break several conspiracy efforts. And as a result, he knew what it takes to successfully pull off a conspiracy. Successful conspiracies typically involve the following 5 conditions. First, if you're going to pull this off, you need to have a small number of conspirators. The smaller the number of conspirators, the more likely the conspiracy will be a success. Lies are difficult to maintain, and the fewer the number of people that have to continue that lie, the better. Also, They need to be able to do it over a short time span. It is hard enough to tell a lie once. Even more difficult to repeat the lie consistently over a long period of time. For this reason, the shorter the conspiracy, the better. The ideal conspiracy was if two people committed the crime and then one of them killed the other right after the crime, and then they only had to repeat it once, maybe twice. That's a conspiracy that would be awfully hard to break. Another thing that is key to maintaining a successful conspiracy is thorough and immediate communication. Because one or more of the conspirators are eventually going to be questioned by the authorities. So the other co-conspirators, they had better know everything, and I mean every minute detail that they say in the interrogation. Conspirators, they need to be able to tell each other quickly what they've said to the authorities and friends and family members. And also, it really helps if there are significant relational connections. When all the co-conspirators are connected in deep and meaningful relationships, it is much harder to convince one another to give up the other person. When all the conspirators are family members, for example, this task is almost impossible. The greater the relational bond between all the conspirators, the greater the potential of success. And finally, and most importantly, to successfully maintain a conspiracy, there needs to be little or no pressure. Few suspects will confess to the truth unless they recognize the danger if they don't. Unless pressured to confess, conspirators, they're just going to keep on lying because it's getting them something. And you know what? The pressure doesn't even have to be physical in nature either. When suspects fear incarceration or maybe condemnation from their peers, they will often respond in an effort to save face or save their own skin. And this gets even harder to maintain as the number of co-conspirators increases. It's that old saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. You could have 12 really strong-willed, determined, really great liars, but if that 13th guy is weak-willed, the whole thing's going down. The greater the pressure on the co-conspirators, the more likely the conspiracy is to fail. So, could the disciples of Jesus knowingly just lie about the resurrection and keep the secret? Could all of Christianity hinge on the lie of 12 men and a handful of women? Wallace would tell you that that's impossible. The number of conspirators required to successfully accomplish this Christianity conspiracy would have been staggering. The book of Acts tells us that there were a lot of eyewitnesses in that upper room right after Jesus' ascension. And Acts chapter 1 says, these all with one mind were continually devoting themselves to prayer along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. At this time, Peter stood up in the midst of the brethren. A gathering of about 120 persons was there together. So there's 120 people right there that would have needed to have been in on the conspiracy. And Paul told the believers in Corinth that there were even more people that saw the risen Christ. In chapter 15, Paul said at that time, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Okay, so now the count is at 620 co-conspirators who have claimed to have seen the resurrected Jesus. When you look at all the evidence, it is unreasonable to believe the disciples conspired to lie about the resurrection. Here's why. There would have just been too many disciples involved in the conspiracy. I think that's obvious. Also, the apostles would have been required to protect their conspiratorial lies for way too long. When you consider that the Apostle John was in his 90s when he died, we're talking close to 6 decades here. The apostles, they had little or no effective way to communicate with one another in a quick or thorough manner. Given the limited technology of the first century and the geographical distance between the disciples, this would have been an almost impossible story to keep straight. And while there were pairs of family members in the groups of apostles, when it came to all the disciples, most of them had little familial relationships to each other at all. One of the first was a tax collector. There was trust issues from the beginning. And lastly, and obviously, the apostles were aggressively pressured and persecuted as they were scattered from Italy to India. None of them ever admitted to a cover-up or even renounced their faith. Every last one of them died telling the same story. Now, don't get me wrong. We've got to admit that successful conspiracies, they do occur. But if you think you know of one, that's because it wasn't successful. When conspiracies are successful, it's because they involve a small number of incredibly close-knit participants who are in constant communication with each other for a very short period of time without any outside pressure. That wasn't the case for the disciples, was it? These men and women, they were either involved in the greatest and most unlikely conspiracy of all time, or they were simply eyewitnesses who were telling the truth. When Wallace examined the conspiracy of the resurrection and the knowledge that he had about what constitutes a reliable eyewitness, he had no other choice but to conclude that the man Jesus of Nazareth did in fact rise from the dead. From that time on, Wallace became a Christian, and he has since become one of the major voices proclaiming Christianity by looking at the evidence. He has books and podcasts around the title Cold Case Christianity. He has another one called Forensic Faith. They are excellent. I encourage anybody to check them out. Now, I am not going to promote all of the theology that he proclaims. I want to let you know that. But in terms of evidence, facts, and believing in the accurate, logical fact of God, the universe, Jesus, the Bible, and the words of the apostles, this guy is the best. But you know what? There was another man that became a Christian when he began to examine the possibility of a conspiracy. And I think the older members here will really appreciate this particular one. In the early 1970s, President Richard Nixon conspired with a group of men to break all kinds of laws in attempts to spy on and discredit and take out the president's enemies. Yeah, that side of politics has always existed. And one of Nixon's closest advisors, somebody that was on the inside and part of the plan, was a guy named Charles Colson. Because a lot of these events were around the Watergate Hotel, it became known as the Watergate Scandal. Well, the truth about Watergate came out, and Colson went to prison. And while he was there, someone sent him the book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, another amazing book I could not recommend more highly. But while he was in prison, Colson became a Christian. And he has this great thought about whether or not the apostles conspired to create a legend about Jesus rising from the dead. Because he said, I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men of the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me a group of powerless fishermen could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. The apostles proclaimed Jesus' death and his burial and his resurrection. They proclaimed it until the day they died. But those were just 12 men. Hundreds and hundreds of others saw Jesus before and after his death, and they proclaimed the same thing. There is no way all of these people could know that they were lying and keep on lying, never changing their stories until the day they died. Doesn't happen. But what if they didn't know they were lying? Just because someone truly, sincerely believes something, that doesn't make it the truth, does it? People make tremendous sacrifices for what they believe in all the time. In 1963, a Buddhist monk set himself on fire in protest of how they were being treated in Vietnam. People have blown themselves up and killed many others in the name of their particular religion. Would anybody doubt the sincerity of their conviction? So, what if Jesus never appeared to the people after his death? What if people just really believed that they saw him? Then they're not lying. Then their conviction is sincere and they would go to death, never changing the story of what they believed that they saw. Is that possible? The hallucination theory asserts that the many people who saw Jesus in his resurrected body, they just imagined that they saw him. They saw something and they just wanted it to be Jesus so badly that they convinced themselves that they saw him. And we are all familiar with people who see images of Jesus or his mother Mary even today. It happens. Could it have happened here? First, it's important to note that true hallucinations, they come from inside of a person, not from the outside. Meaning, hallucinations are entirely subjective. What I see is pretty unique to me and my worldview. Also, psychology tells us that generally only particular kinds of people have legitimate diagnosable hallucinations. People who are paranoid or schizophrenic, or people under the influence of drugs. The New Testament tells us, however, that all kinds of people saw Jesus after his resurrection. He appeared to different ages, different occupations, different backgrounds, different viewpoints. These are all of the people: Mary Magdalene, Mary, Salome, Joanna, 2 on the road to Emmaus, Peter, disciples without Thomas, all the disciples, 7 by the Sea of Galilee, 500 at one time, and James, the brother of Jesus. All of these completely different people had the exact same experience. And another major thing to remember, that it was not all at once. It was over 40 days that this happened. And in each case, it led them to exactly the same conclusion. None of them were skeptical about what they saw. And really, we can't forget Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus. Now, I've heard it argued that Saul had heat exhaustion, or maybe some kind of stroke, or even a brain aneurysm, and that is what happened to him, not an actual vision of Jesus. Now, while Saul did not physically touch the body of Jesus like the other ones did, and by the way, he never claimed that he did, but he still had the same vision a whole lot later than the other guys, and came to the same conviction to join the people he used to persecute. And you know what? Over the years, when it comes to this particular theory about whether or not everybody could have hallucinated it, there's doctors of psychology and theology that have said a few things on this. There's one doctor named Gary Habermas. He is a distinguished professor of apologetics and philosophy. He is the chairman of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. He put it very, very simply when he said that these different individuals in each of these circumstances would all be candidates for hallucinations really stretches the limit of credibility. Now, maybe right now you're thinking to yourself, yeah, but Josh, isn't mass hallucination a thing? Doesn't that exist? There are cases of it, and so I thought about that too. Because I know, maybe you do too, I know people who say they have witnessed miracles and healings and the exorcising of demons. I know people who say they've seen these things, they believe it. But again, science tells us this. It is possible for people that are already in a hysterical mental state to be highly susceptible to suggestion. Say there is a very energetic, lively evangelical church service, and there is a very energetic, enigmatic guy up there whipping that crowd into a frenzy. This can be strong enough that people become convinced that they have seen something that wasn't actually real. But the thing we got to remember is that it has to be happening all at the same time, not over a period of 40 days. Well, what if they were all drugged? What if they're all just tripping on shrooms? It is also possible for people to have a similar reaction to some hallucination-inducing circumstances. Dropping acid somewhere, I don't know. But every drug counselor, every psychologist, every counselor, everybody that's got any kind of learning and letters after their name will tell you that it is virtually impossible for two people to have 100% identical hallucinations. Dr. Peter Kreeft is a doctor of philosophy, and he's a professor at Boston College. I really like his quote here. He said, hallucinations usually happen only once, except to the insane. This one returned many times to ordinary people. 500 separate Elvis sightings may be dismissed, but if 500 simple fishermen in Maine saw, touched, and talked with Elvis at once in the same town, that would be a different matter. And we have to point out that hallucinations do not really cause people to change or create new beliefs. Remember, we said hallucinations come from inside. Remember, it is based on something they already have a tendency to believe or want to believe. We mentioned Saul. I want to go back, and I want us to remember that Jesus appeared to his brother James. I got to be honest, of all the appearances, this is the one I would want to be a fly on the wall for. James never believed Jesus was the Messiah while he was alive. He wasn't there when his big brother was crucified. It was family shame. He was gone. He was out of there. And then after his brother's death, something happens to James to change his mind. He becomes a preacher of the gospel and a leader of the church. And like we said last night, he dies for his faith. History tells us that James was stoned to death, dying saying the person he grew up with was the Messiah and came back from the dead. Something happened to him. A hallucination? Maybe. One identical to all the others at different times, resulting in the same convictions that are totally opposite of the ones that he had? No. Not at all. If you are somebody that needs logic and science and evidence, well, the hallucination theory does not hold up against logic or science or evidence. Now, over the past 3 nights, we have given into the atheist argument, and we've said several times, okay, let's just pretend this is true. What would this mean? We've done that for the atheist arguments. I would now like to ask that they do the same for us. I want to talk to the non-believers. I'm not so naive as to think that every single person sitting here is 100% convinced that everything about the resurrection is true. In a group even of this size, there's going to be somebody that has doubts. So I would like to ask the doubters, the skeptics, when it comes to whether or not Jesus rose from the dead, just go with me here. What if he did? What if he really did rise from the dead? What if the stories of people finding an empty tomb and seeing their teacher after his death and passing along his message of love and hope and repentance, what if they are not what the critics claim? What if they're not ancient myths? What if they're not exaggerations or flat-out lies told by his followers to support their cause? What if it really is true that he died and was later alive again? What would that mean? What would the implications be for you and me if this is true? I want to spend the rest of our time. I want to give you 6 things to think about. Just plant some seeds of thought. Kick these ideas around in your head. If you want to talk to me later about them, I would be delighted to study them with you. 6 important implications that must be true if the resurrection of Jesus is true. If he really rose, then everything else he said must be true. I just don't see how somebody could say they were coming back from the dead and then actually come back from the dead and be confused about who they really were. If he wasn't lying about something amazing as that, then he wasn't lying about the other stuff either. And Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life, and nobody comes to the Father except through me. All the other things he said must be true if he rose from the dead. And I get it. Maybe that's why you're struggling so much with believing this. Maybe that is why you have doubts, because if he really did come back from the dead, then that changes everything. That might change the way that you view the universe itself, because if the resurrection is real, then that means God exists. Jesus spoke about an all-powerful God that sent him to earth. Do you remember when Philip asked to see the Father in John 14? You remember what Jesus said? He said, have I been with you so long and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How could you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak of my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Now, maybe the apostles didn't get it at the time, but his enemies sure did, because they were picking up stones, getting ready to kill him for blasphemy over this. He said he was more than a man. He said he was divine. He claimed to be God. So if he rose and God exists, then that means the God of the Bible exists. And that means that he is the creator and we are the creation. We did not get here through millions of years of raw chance. He made us. And if that's the case, then he has the right to tell us what to do. He has the authority and right as the creator to rule in our lives. He said in Matthew 28, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. So that means that there are some rules we must follow, because the creator has given us rules. I am not free to do whatever I want without consequences. I am not free to define morality as I see fit. I can't say that my truth is just as valid as your truth because I didn't set the standard for what truth is. I didn't make the rules. God did. It seems that in today's society, if there is a recognized sin, it's to tell people that they're wrong. But if Jesus rose from the dead, then God exists. And he says how I'm supposed to live. He says how I'm supposed to behave. And if I don't live by those rules, then he says I'm wrong. And that has some tremendously practical implications for my life. What that means is all that stuff in the Bible, and I mean all of it, it's true. And you and I don't get to pick the stuff we like we're at the buffet in Golden Corral. We have to do what all of it says. That means lust is breaking the rules of the Creator. You don't have the right to do whatever you feel like doing with your body because you didn't make it. He did. Love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you. Uh-oh, you done that this week yet? It's the law. Whoever divorces his wife except for the cause of sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. That is the rule from the Creator that governs marriage. No matter how I feel, I have to do what the Creator says, because he has that right as the Creator. Now, this next one might not be where you're expecting me to go, but think about this implication. If Jesus rose from the dead, then that means all of the Old Testament stories are true. I want you to think about this, because this one will really change your world view. If you are a believer and you tell people that you believe that God created the universe in 6 days and rested on the seventh, like the Old Testament says, some people will laugh at you and question your intelligence. If you say you believe there was a giant flood that covered the earth and only Noah and his family were saved, if you say you believe a great fish swallowed some dude named Jonah and spat him out again 3 days later and he was alive, if you say there was a woman who turned into a pillar of salt because she wanted to go back to an evil city, some people are going to look at you like you're crazy. There are people that call themselves Christians that snicker at the idea of those things really happening. It seems like the general idea of society is that these Old Testament stories are just that, stories. And no enlightened person in the year 2020 really believes that they are true. If you think that, then you run into a problem called Jesus Christ. Because Jesus believed the stories of the Old Testament. And if he really rose, then everything he said was true. And Jesus taught the Old Testament as truth. In Matthew 19, he's debating about divorce with the Pharisees, and he makes his point by pointing back to creation and what God did in Genesis. And he taught from the Old Testament and other places too. In Matthew 24, for as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. In Luke 17, remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it. In Matthew 12, for just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And he's talking about the context of his own resurrection here that we've been studying for the past 2 nights. Think about that for a moment. You can laugh and dismiss the stories of the Old Testament, but when you do, you're laughing at Jesus because he believed them. If he really rose, then they're true. And if Jesus really rose from the grave, if all the things he said really are true, then guys, that means death is not the end. That means there's something after this life. While he was coping with his own grief at the loss of his friend Lazarus, while he was trying to make Lazarus' sister feel better, he said in John 11, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. He said in the previous chapter, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will be able to snatch them out of my hands. And then in arguably the most well-known verse in the Bible, certainly the New Testament, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Now, if you're a doubter, I understand it could be really scary for you if the resurrection is true. Maybe you think the resurrection, that's going to lead to bad news for you. But actually, all of this sounds like good news to me. Because the guy that lived after he died promised me life after death. How amazing is that? If you are not a believer in the resurrection, I doubt I convinced you in this short time. But I want you to think about these things. Because whether or not you believe, don't you think this is important to figure out? Don't you think this is something that you really need to consider? Because if the atheist is right, then when I die, I die. But if the Bible is right, what happens when I die? Like I said, please don't dismiss these thoughts. Let's let them ruminate around in your head for a while. We've spent 2 nights studying the resurrection. And it seems that as long as there is a remote possibility of explaining the resurrection using natural means, modern people say we shouldn't jump so quickly to a supernatural explanation. Okay. Is there a reasonable, natural explanation for this? I don't think so. You need to be a seeker of the truth, no matter what. It's good to examine the resurrection, but you need to be honest about what you find, just like J. Warner Wallace was, even if it seems strange and a little bit scary. I hope that many of us, though, we are more convinced this week than ever before that the resurrection was real. He rose from the dead. It is actually the most logical explanation. He said he was going to do it, and he did it. But it was not just to prove his identity. His death and resurrection actually had a deeper and more personal meaning for you and me. It was so we could be forgiven of sins. It was so that we could establish a relationship with him, so that when we do mess up, and we're human, we're gonna mess up. When we do mess up, we can ask for forgiveness. But that connection only comes when we reenact his death and resurrection through baptism. Now, I admit I went a little bit longer than I usually like to. I appreciate your patience. I'll do my best to give that time back to you tomorrow night. I told you guys that for 11 years I was a counselor at a center for at-risk youth. The last 4 years I was the manager of that department. I had 8 counselors under me. And the one thing that I drilled into every new counselor was that the reality is that we won't be able to save everyone. But if somebody does not complete this program, it will not be because we let go. It will be because they chose to walk away. If you decide to take on the name of Christ, he will not let you go. You will be his unless you decide to walk away. If you're here tonight and you feel the need to take care of your spirituality between you and God, you can come forward now while we stand and while we